Good morning and welcome to Together in God, a media ministry of Grace and St. John's Lutheran Churches. We are affiliated with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. We are happy to share with you God's message of love and hope. Today's service is being brought to you from St. John's Lutheran Church. The church is located at 1804 Highland Avenue in Eau Claire. Please join us now in worship.
I invite children to come forward, and actually anyone who feels like going for a walk and would like to stretch their legs a little bit can come on up. Got a few coming all the way from up there. They're going to get a workout in today. Good morning. Today we're talking about going on a walk. This is one of the most important walks that have ever happened. And while we talk about this walk, I think we should go for a walk. So, stand up, follow me, let's go for a walk. This walk was 7 miles long. Have any of you ever walked 7 miles? You biked it maybe? Yeah? Okay. 7 miles would be like walking from here out to Oakwood Mall and back again. Okay? Now that's a little bit of a walk. This walk took approximately three hours. You know, they weren't power walking back then. They were just walking to get somewhere. They didn't ride horses. The only people who had horses were soldiers, really. So they had to walk everywhere. Now, these people wanted to go for a walk. They had to get to this place 7 miles away, so they went for a walk. They just went for a walk, and they were kind of out of it for a while. And these people went for a walk, and they were in Jerusalem, and I looked up the temperatures this morning, and if it were April in Jerusalem, it probably, think we can get through here? There's some thickets we have to get through here. It was probably about 70 degrees on a normal day. And it hardly ever rains in Jerusalem in April. So they didn't have to carry umbrellas or anything. They had to carry some water though. So I've got my water bottle if any of us gets thirsty. Okay, so we're on this walk. Come on. See, they're all wondering where we went. They have no idea. Holy Week. And they were. What was all that about? You know, that stuff about, when Jesus died on the cross, and then there were these people that were saying something about they thought they saw him again. And everybody's going, huh? What? And these people were walking along, and they were talking to each other. And they were saying, do you know what happened? I don't get it. Do you get it? And they all said, I really don't get it. Well, something happened later on that walk. As they were walking along and chatting away about what was going on, for 3 hours, a stranger came up to them. And the stranger started talking to them, and that changed everything. Now listen to the gospel reading that I'm going to do now after you go back to your seats. And you'll find out who showed up on that long walk from Jerusalem. Okay? Now, I got some good exercise. I hope you did. And you up in the balcony, good workout today. Okay. Rest of you, thanks for coming up. We'll see you next week. Invite you to stand for the gospel acclamation. Gospel according to Luke, the 24th chapter. Glory to you, Lord. Now on that same day when Jesus had appeared to Mary Magdalene, 2 disciples were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they're talking with each other about all these things that had happened. And while they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" And they stood still, looking sad. And then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" And he asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the temple early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but did not see him. And then he said to them, 'Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter his glory?' And then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near to the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, 'Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over.' So he went to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, 'Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?' That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 7 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, 'The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon.' And then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Christ. Some of us remember a time when Paul Harvey was one of America's most popular radio personalities. His claim to fame was a regular feature called "The Rest of the Story." Harvey would tell a story that appeared to be only mildly interesting and not particularly noteworthy. The catch was that in telling it, he would leave out one key detail. And at the very end, he would reveal that missing detail. As the significance of the story suddenly came to light, he would finish by saying, "And now you know the rest of the story." Here's an example of the kind of story Harvey did, although this one isn't exactly one that he used. Early in the 18th century, a man was walking down a street in a city in Virginia, dressed in well-worn working clothes. He was quietly going about his business when the door of a butcher shop flew open. Out stepped a very well-dressed, pompous man, followed by a butcher who was holding a very large, bad-tempered turkey. The self-important fellow glanced around and saw this guy walking alone. He summoned the man and signaled to the butcher to hand over the turkey to him. "Follow me," he barked at his new recruit. And the two marched through the streets in single file, one strutting arrogantly in front, the other behind, lugging this large, flapping turkey. Eventually, they reached an expensive house where a servant came out and collected the turkey. The snooty man tossed a coin to his errand runner, and without a word of thanks, bid him go on his way. The man who carried the turkey for him then walked home, flipping the coin in the air and chuckling to himself. At this point, there's nothing noteworthy about this incident, other to demonstrate there were still incidents of old British upper-class privilege in America. But you might be interested in the name of the fellow who was rudely commandeered into hauling that turkey. His name was John Marshall, who at the time was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, one of the most powerful men in the nation, in fact, in all of United States history. Marshall could have put that arrogant man in his place with just a few words. He could have reduced him to a cowering mess, begging forgiveness for the shabby treatment of a great public figure. He could have used his influence to make the man's life miserable. Marshall, however, lived by a creed that said power is something to be used only in the service of others, or it is not to be used at all. Setting his ego aside, he just went along with this ridiculous scenario. Instead of getting puffed up and angry, he found himself actually amused by the absurdity of it. And now you know the rest of the story. One that gives stunning insight into the character of one of America's foremost political figures and how things have changed in our time. Our gospel story for today contains a classic, now you know the rest of the story element. Two men are walking on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus, a small town about 7 miles away. Neither of them is among Jesus' 12 close disciples. Rather, they are part of a larger group of people devoted to Jesus, many of whom followed him on his travels. It is afternoon of Easter. The men are bewildered and emotionally drained by all that has taken place these past days. They had entered Jerusalem with such high hopes, believing Jesus was the Messiah, the promised one who would defeat Israel's enemies, restore Israel to its former glory, and bring about an endless, peaceful reign in Israel. It was all going so well. Jesus had demonstrated awesome powers. He had arrived in Jerusalem to the roars of the crowd. People were on his side. Jesus was so close to claiming the throne. The age of the Messiah was at hand. And then the whole thing came crashing down. And it happened so fast. Suddenly, Jesus was betrayed, condemned, and crucified. So much hope, so much disappointment. Add to that the weirdness of this morning. Incredible reports of a vision to some women that Jesus had risen. And the reminder that Jesus had said something about being killed and then rising on the third day. The reaction of the apostles who considered the women delirious. Then Peter finding that at least part of the women's story checked out. Jesus was gone from the tomb. None of this makes sense to Cleopas and his pal. Jesus was killed by corrupt politicians in the most shameful way possible. There's no way that could happen to a Messiah. The Messiah was invincible. He was to come in power and majesty to rule and bring justice to the land. But Jesus didn't do that. So whatever Jesus was, he was not the Messiah. Obviously, they had made a big mistake. As for whatever else was swirling around in rumor land, all right, that was strange, but it really didn't change what happened to Jesus. Cleopas and friend were so convinced Jesus was not the Messiah that even with all these bizarre claims of an empty tomb that day, they did not wait around in Jerusalem to see what happened. For them, it was over. Even if by some miracle Jesus was pulling off some kind of magic trick, even if this rising on the third day was something he had predicted, what was the point of that? They'd been duped once on this Messiah promise. They weren't going to fall for that again. So they left town that very day, headed back home, sadder but wiser. They were not going to fall for that again. On their trip, they were still trying to sort out just what happened in this crazy week. How could it all have gone south so quickly? Just what was Jesus' game? Was he somehow alive like people were claiming? And if so, what did that mean? And if not, what explained those stories? They were going over these events as they walked. In fact, it appears they were having a fairly lively and loud discussion when a stranger came near and asked, "What are you guys talking about?" At first, they just stood there, looking sad. There may have been some fear involved as well. Jesus' followers had been in hiding, anxious that the authorities might be after them as well. Maybe they shouldn't have been so free with their thoughts out in the open where a stranger could hear them. Finally, Cleopas breaks the awkward silence by cautiously phrasing a question that gives no hint of their position. Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days? What things? Asked the stranger innocently. If this man truly doesn't know, then he obviously doesn't have a dog in his fight. So Cleopas lets down his guard and fills him in. And at one point he says, we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. That's in the past tense. He doesn't think that now. Jesus was no Messiah. At the same time, you can't make heads or tails of this ultimately disappointing adventure with Jesus. That's why he can't stop talking about it. The conversation then takes a shocking turn as a stranger who appeared to know nothing about this whole Jesus movement now scolds the two for not recognizing what was right in front of their faces. So Jesus could not be the Messiah because he suffered and was executed instead of taking over the government and ruling in power. Haven't you read the scriptures? That's exactly what you would expect a Messiah to do. These two men have no clue what the stranger is talking about, so he invites them into a walking Bible study. We don't have any notes on how he presented that study, but based on what the stranger was saying, that he started with Moses and then went through all the prophets, we can make a pretty good guess. He started at the point in Exodus where God had enough of people breaking the covenant God had set up for their benefit. They were so arrogant and sinful and heartless that God came this close to ending this relationship with humans. And we see that God decided to forgive rather than wipe the slate clean. The stranger moves on to the books of the prophets where we see the same thing happening time after time. God loving and forgiving, people defying God, acting selfishly, causing destruction. Is this ever going to stop? Are people ever going to take seriously who God is and what God desires? How can injustice be brought to an end if people refuse to act in justice? Maybe it can't happen. The stranger walks them through the books of the prophets, where God keeps wrestling with this dilemma. Is there any way to ensure justice short of destroying creation? Is it possible to love people and destroy them at the same time? The prophets reveal that God finally finds an answer to how to remain true to both love and justice. God will bring about justice not by destroying sinful humanity, but by overwhelming it with love. Justice will come in the concept of the Messiah, of being so connected with God, so much a part of God, yet so thoroughly human, that through this Messiah, all the world will finally understand the height and depth of God's love. Through this Messiah, all people in the world will receive hope of lives filled with peace, joy, and justice. Unfortunately, until the Messiah came and people could actually experience up close what God was like, they were susceptible to wrong guesses. For centuries, people reading about the Messiah had put their own spin on it according to their own desires. People crave political power, military power, economic power, revenge, status, and redemption. And so in their minds, the Messiah was the promised one who would bring these things to the people of Israel. They took the idea of the Messiah and made him in their own image, a mighty king who would come and destroy all of Israel's enemies, who would establish Israel over all other nations and lead it to a time of unparalleled peace and prosperity. When Jesus came along, that was the prevailing view of the Messiah. The people saw Jesus' remarkable power and wisdom and charisma and wondered, is this the promised one? Many decided he was, and they decided to help the process along. In the Gospel of John, thousands converged on Jesus to declare him a king, and Jesus wanted none of that. Has it ever seemed odd to you that the people on Palm Sunday were ecstatic in their praise of Jesus, And just a few days later, these same people were shouting for him to be crucified. What would cause such a bizarre and dramatic change of heart? Well, what if you thought Jesus was the Messiah, the warrior king who has come to fight for Israel's freedom from Roman oppression and establish the mightiest nation on earth? And then a few days later, you hear Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane ordering Peter to put away his sword, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Those are not the words of the expected Messiah. It becomes crystal clear over these days that Jesus is not who they thought he was. Some of his biggest backers may have felt betrayed, which accounts for some of the venom they hurled his way. At best, they felt disappointed. The crucifixion clinches it for people like Cleopas. And that's why they're so demoralized and confused. Perhaps in his Bible study, the stranger pointed out that Messiah means anointed one, that it does not refer to a military or political leader, but simply a person set apart by God and enabled for a special task. That task was to redeem creation by overwhelming it with love. The stranger may have pointed out Isaiah 53. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with grief. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and only by his bruises are we healed. Jesus was the Messiah, the one from God who had come into the world to restore creation. But it's not the kingdom people were hoping for. It was not the kingdom his disciples were hoping for. Instead, the Messiah had come to show the true nature of God, to show how great is God's love. The Messiah was God's final answer to the paradox of love and justice. Justice will come about in creation, not by destroying failed humanity, but by overwhelming it with love. After the stranger explains all this to him, the two men compassionately invite him to sit and share a meal with them. And at the end of this, before he leaves them, the stranger reveals one key bit of information. By the way, I'm Jesus. And now they know the rest of the story. Now we too know the rest of the story. We know what really happened on Calvary's Hill and at the tomb on Easter morning. It was not a magic trick. It was not a power play. The Messiah came to bring justice to creation, not by destroying the failure of humanity, but by overwhelming it with love. Thanks be to God. Amen.
God, who has brought us from death to life, fill you with great joy. Almighty God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, bless you now and forever. Amen.
Thank you for being a part of Together in God, brought to you today by St. John's Lutheran Church. Your prayers and financial support are always deeply appreciated, and the hand of fellowship and ministry is extended to you. St. John's holds services on Sunday mornings at 8:15 and 10:45 a.m., and on Monday evening at 7 p.m. Please tune in again next Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Until we meet again, may God bless you.